In the spring of 1944, a captured American P-51 Mustang touched down at Rechlin, a secret Luftwaffe testing facility hidden in the forests north of Berlin. For months, the Reich's finest fighter pilots had been dying in unprecedented numbers, torn apart by silver American fighters that seemed to appear from nowhere, strike with devastating speed and vanish before German reinforcements could respond. Now, for the first time, they would climb into the cockpit of their nemesis and discover its secrets. The commander of Rechlin's test squadron was Hauptmann Hans Werner Lerche, a decorated ace with dozens of kills to his name. He'd flown every major fighter in the European theater, Spitfires, Hurricanes, captured Soviet Yaks, but nothing prepared him for what he'd experience in the next 45 minutes. When Lerche climbed down from that first flight, he wrote something in the facility's logbook that would haunt German aviation leadership. "We are not fighting an enemy. We are fighting the future itself." But what did he discover in that cockpit? What could be so devastating that it would shatter the confidence of Germany's most experienced test pilot? The answer reveals not just why Germany lost the air war, but why they were doomed from the moment the first Mustang rolled off the assembly line. This is the story of how a single captured aircraft exposed the fatal flaw in German strategic thinking, a flaw that cost them air superiority, then France, then ultimately the entire war. Before we understand what Lerche discovered at 25,000 feet, we need to go back to where it all began, not in the skies over Germany, but in the design bureaus and strategic planning sessions of 1940, when both sides were making decisions that would determine who would control the air over Europe. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 was by any measure a masterpiece. When it entered service in 1937, it was the fastest, most advanced fighter aircraft in the world. German engineers had created something remarkable, a lightweight, agile predator that could outmaneuver anything in the sky. Every design choice reflected the Luftwaffe's tactical doctrine: reach the battlefield quickly, establish local air superiority, support the ground offensive, return to base. The 109's fuel capacity gave it roughly 90 minutes of flight time. For the Blitzkrieg campaigns that conquered Poland, France, and the Low Countries, this was perfect. The Luftwaffe wasn't planning for strategic depth. They were planning for tactical dominance. The fighter was a scalpel, not a sword, precise, deadly, designed for short, decisive engagements. And for the first 2 years of the war, this philosophy seemed vindicated by an unbroken string of victories. Across the Atlantic, American engineers were asking a completely different question. In 1940, Britain was hemorrhaging bombers over occupied Europe. RAF bombing raids penetrated perhaps 100 miles into enemy territory before their fighter escorts ran out of fuel and had to turn back. From that point forward, the bombers were defenseless and German fighters slaughtered them. The British came to North American aviation with a desperate question: could you design a fighter that could escort bombers not just to the border, but all the way to the target and back? Most aircraft designers would have said it was impossible. The physics seemed unforgiving. Fuel weighs 8 pounds per gallon. More fuel meant more weight. More weight meant worse performance. You could have range or you could have maneuverability, but not both. The conventional wisdom said long-range fighters would be sluggish targets for short-range interceptors. North American aviation decided to challenge that assumption. Chief designer Edgar Schmood began with a radical premise. What if we designed the entire aircraft around the fuel tanks? Not fuel tanks fitted into an existing airframe, but an airframe sculpted around maximum fuel capacity while maintaining aerodynamic efficiency. The result was the P-51 Mustang, but its early versions had a critical weakness. Powered by the Allison engine, the early Mustangs were beautiful at low altitude, but gasped for breath above 15,000 feet. Unfortunately, that's exactly where bomber formations cruised and where German fighters attacked from. The Americans had built a racehorse that couldn't run in the altitude band that mattered most. Did you know that the decision to mate the Mustang's airframe with the British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine almost didn't happen? In April 1942, Royal Air Force test pilot Ronald Harker flew an early Mustang and immediately recognized something extraordinary. The airframe was aerodynamically perfect, clean lines, laminar flow wings, minimal drag. But the Allison engine was strangling it. Harker wrote a 5-page technical report arguing that fitting a Merlin engine with its 2-stage supercharger would transform the Mustang from a low-altitude performer into a high-altitude predator that could dominate at any altitude. His superiors were skeptical. The Merlin was already in desperately short supply for Spitfires and Lancaster bombers. Diverting production capacity seemed wasteful for an unproven American design. But Harker persisted, and in October 1942, the first Merlin-powered Mustang took flight. The results weren't just good. They were revolutionary. The new P-51B could fly at over 440 miles per hour at 30,000 feet, faster than any production fighter Germany possessed. But speed was only part of the transformation. With internal fuel and drop tanks, the Mustang could fly escort missions exceeding 2,000 miles. To put that in perspective, a P-51 could take off from England, escort bombers all the way to Berlin, engage in combat over the target, chase German fighters back to their own airfields, and still have enough fuel to return safely to England. No fighter in the world could match that combination. While American factories were preparing to produce these long-range escorts by the thousands, the Luftwaffe was trapped in a nightmare of their own making. German fighters designed for 90-minute missions were being forced to defend an ever-expanding territory against bombers penetrating deeper into the Reich every month. The Bf-109 was being pushed far beyond its design parameters, climbing desperately to 25,000 feet just to reach the bomber formations, burning precious fuel during the climb, having perhaps 15 to 20 minutes of combat time before fuel considerations forced them to break off and run for base. German pilots weren't just fighting the bombers. They were fighting their own fuel gauges. And here's the truly shocking part. German engineers knew about this problem. They'd known since the Battle of Britain in 1940, when Bf-109s escorting bombers over England could spend barely 10 minutes over the target before fuel forced them home, leaving the bombers defenseless. The lesson was crystal clear: range matters, strategic depth matters, but Germany never truly addressed this fundamental flaw. The question is, why not? The answer reveals something profound about institutional failure. The Luftwaffe's entire doctrine was built on a foundation of short, victorious wars. Everything in German military planning assumed rapid campaigns, quick victories, tactical use of air power to support ground operations. When Hitler's wars stretched into years and spanned continents, the doctrine didn't adapt. The institution couldn't change its fundamental assumptions even when reality was screaming at them to evolve. There's also a darker reason. By 1943, Hermann Göring, the Reichsmarschall commanding the Luftwaffe, was more interested in maintaining his political position than confronting uncomfortable truths. When designers proposed developing long-range fighter variants, Göring dismissed them as defeatist. When field commanders reported being overwhelmed by American escorts, he accused them of cowardice. The Luftwaffe's leadership had become trapped in ideological rigidity at precisely the moment when strategic flexibility meant survival. January 1944 marked the beginning of the end, though few on either side fully understood it yet. American heavy bombers had been hammering German industrial targets for months, suffering horrific casualties. A 25% loss rate on some missions meant that statistically, a bomber crew wouldn't survive their required tour of duty. The bomber crews called Germany the Big League, and they flew into it knowing the mathematics of death were against them. But in January, something fundamental shifted. P-51 Mustangs began arriving in England in operationally significant numbers, enough to escort the bomber streams deep into the Reich. For the first time, German fighters climbing to intercept the bombers found themselves ambushed by escorts that could outfight them at altitude and had the fuel capacity to chase them all the way back to their own airfields. Suddenly, nowhere was safe. The Luftwaffe's casualty rate spiked catastrophically. In February 1944 alone, the Luftwaffe lost 33% of its fighter pilots, killed, wounded, or missing. At that attrition rate, the entire fighter force would be statistically annihilated in less than 6 months. These weren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. These were experienced pilots, men who understood air combat, who'd survived dozens of missions. They were being replaced by teenagers with barely 50 hours of flight training. German pilots began filing alarming combat reports. The Americans flew in coordinated teams with iron discipline. The Mustangs could dive on German formations at high speed, engage briefly, and if the fight turned against them, simply open their throttles and accelerate away. The Bf-109 and FW-190 couldn't catch a Mustang in level flight above 20,000 feet. This created a psychological horror. You couldn't run, you couldn't hide, and you were being forced to fight outnumbered and obsolescent aircraft. Lieutenant Heinrich Sturm, a Bf-109 pilot, wrote in his diary after a mission in March 1944, "We are like infantrymen attacking tanks. We have courage and skill, but they have machines that make our courage irrelevant. Every day more friends don't return. Every day the Americans grow stronger and more confident. How long can this continue before there's no one left?" The Luftwaffe High Command, desperate to understand the source of American air superiority, issued orders to capture a P-51 intact if possible. Intelligence officers wanted to examine every detail: construction, systems, performance characteristics. Several attempts were made to force damaged Mustangs down without destroying them, but Allied pilots generally chose to crash land behind friendly lines or bail out over safe territory. Then, on March 15, 1944, luck intervened for the Germans. Lieutenant Robert Perkins from the 357th Fighter Group was hit by anti-aircraft fire during a low-level strafing run near Brunswick. His Merlin engine began hemorrhaging coolant. Perkins realized he couldn't make it across the front lines. He attempted to destroy the aircraft following standing orders, but his damaged Mustang was losing altitude so rapidly that he had to choose: bail out immediately or die. He jumped at the last possible moment. The P-51B, without its pilot, glided into a forced landing in a farm field. The landing gear tore away, but the fuselage remained largely intact. A Wehrmacht unit reached the site within the hour and immediately recognized the intelligence value. The aircraft was placed under armed guard and transported by rail to Rechlin. The arrival of an intact Mustang caused immediate excitement at the testing facility. For months, Luftwaffe pilots had been filing reports about this American fighter's capabilities. But intelligence reports are one thing. Actual hands-on evaluation is entirely different. Technical officers swarmed over the captured P-51 like surgeons examining a patient that had somehow survived an impossible disease. What they discovered challenged many of their fundamental assumptions about aircraft design. The Mustang was heavier than a Bf-109, yet faster. It was more complex, yet more reliable in the field. It carried more fuel than any single-engine fighter they'd examined. Yet its actual range exceeded even their intelligence estimates. Did you know that German engineers were actually shocked by how crude some aspects of the P-51's construction appeared? German aircraft were built like Swiss watches. Exquisite attention to detail, hand-fitted parts, close tolerances requiring skilled craftsmen. The Mustang, by contrast, was built like an American automobile. Simplified manufacturing techniques, designed for assembly by semi-skilled workers, panels that could be replaced in the field by mechanics with basic training. To German eyes accustomed to viewing aircraft as precision instruments, the Mustang looked almost brutish. But that simplicity was itself a sophisticated strategy. The Americans had recognized that in total industrial war, building 10 good aircraft quickly was more valuable than building one perfect aircraft slowly. This philosophy was visible in every rivet and seam. Some German engineers, walking around the Mustang taking notes, understood for perhaps the first time the true nature of the war they were fighting. This wasn't just about who had the best technology. It was about who could produce the most good enough technology, maintain it under field conditions, and replace losses faster than the enemy could inflict them. But theoretical analysis could only reveal so much. The real test would come when someone actually flew it. Hauptmann Hans Werner Lerche was the obvious choice. He'd flown virtually every fighter type in the European theater, including captured Allied aircraft. He was technically proficient, tactically sophisticated, and most importantly, brutally honest in his evaluations. If anyone could assess the Mustang's true capabilities, it was Lerche. On a clear morning in late March 1944, Lerche walked out to the captured P-51B. German mechanics had repaired the battle damage, replaced the damaged coolant system, and painted crude Balkenkreuz crosses over the American stars. Lerche strapped into the cockpit. Even before starting the engine, he noticed differences. The cockpit was spacious compared to the cramped confines of a Bf-109. Visibility was excellent. The bubble canopy provided an unobstructed view in nearly every direction. The control layout was logical and ergonomic. He started the Merlin engine. The sound was immediately distinctive, a deep, powerful roar that spoke of the massive industrial capacity that could produce such engines by the thousands. Lurch taxied to Rechlin's main runway, advanced the throttle smoothly and lifted off. What happened in the next 45 minutes would change everything. Lurch climbed the Mustang to 25,000 feet, the altitude where most bomber interceptions occurred. He began running through standard test protocols, acceleration runs, maximum speed tests, turning performance at various speeds, high-speed dives, zoom climbs. With each maneuver, his assessment grew more grave. The P-51's controls remained light and responsive at all speeds. There was no control stiffening in high-speed dives, a problem that plagued German fighters. The aircraft accelerated rapidly, reaching 450 miles per hour in level flight at altitude. When he pushed into a dive, the Mustang remained stable and controllable, even as the airspeed indicator climbed past 500 miles per hour, speeds at which the Bf-109 became dangerously unstable. He threw the Mustang into violent combat, maneuvers, snap rolls, barrel rolls, split-S reversals. The aircraft responded instantly to control inputs. There was none of the sluggishness he'd expected from a fighter carrying so much fuel. Then Lurch checked his fuel gauge and experienced what he later described as genuine shock. After 40 minutes of aggressive flight, including simulated combat maneuvers, the Mustang still had more than half its internal fuel remaining. The implications hit him like a physical blow. A German pilot in a Bf-109 would already be thinking about heading home. The Mustang pilot could keep fighting for another hour. Lurch landed and immediately requested permission for a comparative flight. The Mustang against frontline German fighters in mock combat. That afternoon, a Bf-109G and an FW-190A scrambled, and Lurch took off to conduct direct comparison dogfights. The results were devastating. At altitudes above 20,000 feet, the P-51 could simply dictate the terms of every engagement. It was faster than both German fighters in level flight. It could outdive both. The Bf-109, lighter and more agile at low speeds, initially had an advantage in turning combat. But the instant Lurch applied full throttle, the Mustang would accelerate out of the turn faster than the 109 could follow. The FW-190 performed better, matching the Mustang's speed at lower altitudes. But above 25,000 feet, the American fighter was clearly superior. Most critically, when the mock combat ended, Lurch had enough fuel to fly for another 90 minutes. Both German fighters were approaching their reserves and needed to land immediately. In a real combat situation, this meant the Mustang pilot could pursue German fighters all the way back to their own airfields, attack them during their most vulnerable moment while landing, and still have fuel to return safely home. The test results were compiled into a classified technical report. The conclusions were unambiguous. The P-51 Mustang represented a systematic American advantage in range, high-altitude performance, and operational flexibility that German fighters simply could not match. The report made specific recommendations: develop long-range fighter variants immediately, accelerate jet fighter development, prioritize tactics that could mitigate the Mustang's advantages. When the report reached higher headquarters, the response was not what Lurch expected. Göring reportedly flew into a rage, accusing the test pilots of defeatism and suggesting that Lurch had deliberately flown the German fighters poorly to make the American fighter look superior. Several officers who read the report understood its implications with cold clarity. The Mustang wasn't just a better fighter. It represented industrial and strategic advantages that Germany could no longer overcome. But understanding a problem and fixing it are two different things. By spring 1944, Germany lacked the resources, time, and strategic breathing room to develop long-range fighter variants or accelerate jet production. The captured P-51 had revealed the truth, but it was a truth that arrived too late to matter. Throughout April and May 1944, American fighter tactics became increasingly aggressive. P-51 groups were ordered to leave the bomber formations and sweep ahead, actively hunting German fighters before they could assemble for coordinated attacks. This offensive posture meant Luftwaffe pilots were being bounced while climbing out, intercepted while forming up, and chased all the way back to their bases. The Americans called it fighter sweeps. German pilots called it being hunted. The psychological pressure was immense. Every takeoff carried the knowledge that Mustangs might be waiting anywhere. German pilots had to watch their fuel constantly. Every gallon burned maneuvering defensively was a gallon not available for the mission. The Americans had no such constraints. Their fuel capacity meant they could afford to be aggressive, to burn extra fuel during combat, knowing they'd still make it home. Lieutenant Klaus Bäumer, a Bf-109 pilot who survived the war, later recalled, "By summer 1944, we knew every time we took off we were probably going to die, not because we lacked courage or skill, but because the mathematics were impossible. The Americans could fly anywhere over Germany, stay as long as they wanted, fight on their terms. We could only react, always defensive, always outnumbered, always running out of fuel at the worst possible moment. When I heard test pilots had confirmed what we already knew, I felt strange relief. At least now leadership couldn't pretend we were losing because of pilot inadequacy. We were losing because we were fighting the future with machines from the past. Germany actually possessed the technical capability to respond. Long-range drop tanks existed but were rarely used, partly because German tactics emphasized climb rate, and drop tanks reduced performance during the critical climb to altitude. The Me-262 jet fighter, capable of speeds exceeding 550 miles per hour, could have revolutionized air combat, but production was delayed for years by Hitler's insistence that it be developed as a bomber rather than a fighter, a strategic confusion that wasted precious time. The institutional rigidity that created the short-range fighter problem in the first place now prevented its correction, even when solutions existed. By June 1944, North American aviation was producing P-51 Mustangs at a rate exceeding 400 aircraft per month. Ford Motor Company had opened a second production line. The entire American industrial base had converted to war production, with efficiency that bordered on miraculous. Every Mustang lost in combat was replaced within days. Every pilot killed was replaced by fresh aviators from training programs graduating thousands annually, with 300 or more flight hours. Germany, by contrast, was training fewer pilots with less fuel for training flights. New German pilots arrived at frontline units with perhaps 50 hours of flight experience, half what their American counterparts had. The systemic advantages were compounding exponentially. Better aircraft flown by better trained pilots on longer missions with confidence that losses would be quickly replaced, against fewer German aircraft flown by increasingly inexperienced pilots on shorter missions, with no strategic reserves to fall back on. On August 27, 1944, the Luftwaffe attempted a desperate gamble. Unable to match American fighters qualitatively or quantitatively, German commanders assembled nearly 200 fighters for a massive coordinated assault on a bomber stream heading to Berlin. If they could concentrate overwhelming numbers at a single point, perhaps they could break through the escorts and maul the bombers badly enough to force a pause in operations. Intelligence had somehow leaked the American flight path. The trap was set. It should have been a massacre. Instead, it became a catastrophe for Germany. American radar detected the massive German formation assembling. P-51 groups were vectored to intercept. The German fighters, flying in tight formations to maximize their coordinated attack, were bounced by Mustangs diving out of the sun at high speed. The Americans had altitude, speed, and tactical initiative. What followed was one of the most one-sided air battles of the war. American pilots dove through the German formations, firing at close range, then used their superior speed to climb back to altitude before the Germans could effectively respond. Within 15 minutes, over 40 German aircraft had been shot down. The remaining fighters scattered. The coordinated attack was broken before it ever reached the bombers. Only 3 P-51s were lost. That mission report circulated through both air forces. For the Americans, it confirmed absolute air superiority. For the Germans, it was confirmation that no tactical innovation could compensate for the fundamental disadvantages they faced. The captured P-51 at Rechlin continued to be flown and studied throughout late 1944, with different pilots evaluating it against various German types. Every evaluation reached the same conclusion. The Mustang was superior in almost every measurable category except low-speed turning radius, and even that advantage disappeared when considering the complete tactical picture. A Bf-109 might outturn a Mustang in a slow-speed scissors maneuver, but the Mustang pilot could simply choose not to engage in that type of fight. Some Luftwaffe units developed unofficial policies of avoiding combat with P-51s when possible. Pilots were informally told to focus on bombers and disengage if Mustangs appeared. This marked a complete inversion of fighter doctrine. Fighters exist to establish air superiority so bombers can operate. But German fighters were now trying to avoid enemy fighters to get at the bombers, a tactically impossible task. By December 1944, the strategic air war over Europe was effectively over. Germany still had fighters, still had pilots, and would continue fighting desperately until May 1945. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. American bombers could strike any target in Germany. Luftwaffe interception rates had collapsed from 50% in 1943 to less than 10% by early 1945. The captured P-51 had long since stopped being a curiosity and had become a symbol, a physical reminder of German defeat written in aluminum and aviation fuel. Some historians argue the P-51 Mustang was the single most strategically important aircraft of the European war. This might seem like an exaggeration until you consider what the Mustang enabled. Without long-range escort fighters, the American daylight bombing campaign would have been unsustainable. Without the bombing campaign degrading German war production, the Reich would have remained much stronger. Without air superiority, the D-Day landings would have been vastly more costly, perhaps impossible. The Mustang didn't win the war alone, but it created the conditions that made Allied victory inevitable. The personal stories from this period haunt. German pilots continued flying, knowing they were essentially on suicide missions. One pilot, arriving at his combat unit in January 1945, asked his commander how long pilots typically survived. The commander looked at him and said, 2 weeks, maybe 3 if you're lucky. Don't bother learning everyone's names, they'll be dead before you remember them. When the war ended in May 1945, captured German records revealed the full scope of the catastrophe. The Luftwaffe had lost over 45,000 aircraft during the war, with a majority from 1943 onward, when American fighters arrived in force. More than 18,000 German pilots were killed, an unsustainable loss rate that gutted the force's experience base. In the years after the war, several Luftwaffe pilots who'd flown against Mustangs were interviewed by historians. One recurring theme emerges: professional respect for the aircraft even while hating what it represented. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, a decorated ace, said in 1982, "The P-51 was a beautiful aircraft. As a pilot, I could appreciate its design, its capabilities. It was what we wished our fighters could have been if we'd had the strategic vision and industrial capacity. But every time I saw one, I knew it represented overwhelming power that was crushing us. When our test pilots flew the captured Mustang and reported back, I think many of us truly understood we'd lost the war. We just didn't know how much longer the dying would continue." The story of German pilots flying a captured P-51 and finally understanding why they were losing is really a story about how organizations succeed or fail when confronting changing realities. The Luftwaffe was built around doctrine that had worked brilliantly from 1939 to 1941. Short-range tactical fighters supporting rapid ground offensives had been devastatingly effective. But when the nature of the war changed, when Germany found itself fighting a defensive strategic war rather than an offensive tactical war, the organization couldn't adapt. Meanwhile, the Americans approached the problem with fresh eyes and no doctrinal baggage. They designed aircraft around strategic requirements rather than forcing requirements to fit existing designs. The P-51 wasn't necessarily more technologically advanced than German fighters, but it was optimized for the strategic mission that actually mattered: long-range bomber escort. There's a lesson here that transcends aviation and military history. In any competitive environment, success comes not just from having excellent capabilities, but from having capabilities that align with strategic requirements. An inferior solution to the right problem will always defeat a superior solution to the wrong problem. When Hauptmann Hans Werner Lerche climbed down from that captured P-51 in March 1944 and wrote, "We are fighting the future with machines from the past," he was acknowledging a truth that German leadership never fully accepted. They had already lost the air war. The Mustang was simply the messenger delivering that verdict. The rest, the continued fighting, the mounting casualties, the final collapse was just the bloody arithmetic of a war already decided. The intersection where this realization occurred wasn't over Berlin or Munich. It was in a cockpit at 25,000 feet, when a German test pilot checked his fuel gauge after 40 minutes of combat maneuvers and realized his opponent could keep fighting for another hour. In that moment, Lersch understood what the captured Mustang truly represented. Not just American technological prowess, but the industrial depth, strategic vision, and institutional flexibility that his country had already lost. That understanding came too late to change anything, but it came with absolute clarity.